Today we'll be talking about how Ukrainian and Russian identities and their types of nationalism are very different, and how this has impacted upon the Russian-Ukrainian war and why Russia and Ukraine diverged to such a great extent after 1991. And looking at the first slide, we're looking at Russia and Ukraine, different post-Soviet transitions. What we're really looking at is how Russia and Ukraine emerged as independent countries when the USSR disintegrated in 1991. And contrary to the assumption that I think many people have, that they had a kind of a similar starting position, that's not true. Ukraine, in this sense, was far more similar to the other non-Russian republics, and Russia was completely unique of these former Soviet republics. The reason being was that when you had this hardline coup in August of 1991, it was defeated by Boris Yeltsin and Russian democratic forces, and then they basically captured everything in Moscow. All of the Soviet institutions in Moscow, the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Defense, the KGB, etc., were all taken over, and they went from being Soviet institutions to Russian institutions. And so state and nation building in Russia from 1991, 1992 was actually top down, because they'd already captured all of these Soviet government and other institutions in Moscow. And that's really important, because Yeltsin and his team weren't just taking over buildings. They were taking over personnel, because these former Soviet people who were, say, working in the Soviet Ministry of Defense began working in the Russian Ministry of Defense, and so on and so on. Former Soviet KGB, like Vladimir Putin, began working for the successors to the KGB, which were the FSB, the SVR, and the FSB is where Putin went to. They also, besides buildings, personnel, inherited mentalities, inherited viewpoints, inherited mindsets and worldviews, and that very much determined the course of relations between Russia and its neighbors in the former Soviet Union, and particularly Russia and its relations with the West. These former Soviet Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Defense, KGB personnel they came with anti-Western attitudes. They came with Russian chauvinistic views towards Ukrainians, and they came with kind of very disparaging and chauvinistic views of Russia's neighbors. They didn't really treat Russia's non-Russian neighbors as real entities, as real countries. They always kind of looked down upon them, and as though they were still the elder brother, like they were in the Soviet Union. In the case of Ukraine, it was very different. Ukraine became an independent state with hardly any institutions in Kiev. These all had to be built from scratch. There was some, of course, small ones. There was some kind of government structure. Ukraine even had a small Ministry of Foreign Affairs because it was a founding member of the United Nations. But this is very much a state and nation building from the bottom up, not from the top down as in Russia. And from the bottom up, therefore, it more closely resembled a post-colonial transition as opposed to some kind of imperial as in Russia. And from the viewpoint of Ukraine, this was 4 transitions rolled into one. Economic, so a transition from a communist to a market economy, capitalist economy, a transition from a Soviet communist totalitarian regime to a democracy, nation building, the creation of an independent Ukrainian nation and an independent Ukrainian state. So 4 different transitions, often colliding with each other, but taking place at the same time. These kinds of transitions in the West would have taken place at different times, not all at once, as in the case of after 1991 in Ukraine and the other non-Russian republics. From the beginning, Russia had problems and difficulties in accepting Ukraine as an independent country. It didn't really accept the fact that Ukrainians should be allowed to decide their own future, their own destiny. There was an assumption that Ukraine should always resemble Belarus, that Ukraine should kind of follow in the path of Alexander Lukashenko's Belarus, pro-Russian kind of Russian satellite or puppet state. But that was never the case in Ukraine. Ukraine was always going to be different to Belarus, something the Russians have never understood. There was, pro-Russian or pro-Soviet sentiment was far weaker in Ukraine always than it was in Belarus. In this sense, you could look at Belarus as one big kind of Donbass, where pro-Soviet, pro-Russian attitudes were far more widespread and popular than were pro-Western Belarusian kind of identities. In Ukraine, it was the opposite. Ukrainian identity was far stronger, and the kind of pro-Russian, pro-Soviet attitudes were only really strongest in Crimea and in the Donbass region, not really anywhere else. But Russia's unwillingness to really, or difficulties to accept an independent Ukraine led to immediately very poor Russian-Ukrainian relations, and taking basically the whole decade of the 1990s it took for Russia to finally agree to Ukraine's border, to sign a treaty recognizing Ukraine's border. This happened firstly in 1997, and then another 2 years it took for the Russian parliament, both houses, to ratify that treaty. So let's recall that during this period of time, there wasn't an anti-Russian leader in power in Ukraine. It was Leonid Kuchma. And yet, despite the fact you had Leonid Kuchma as president, Russia still dragged out this process of being unwilling to recognize Ukraine's border. So that goes to show you the depth of the problem that Russia had in accepting a fully independent Ukraine. From the late 1990s, Ukraine set itself on the path of so-called returning to Europe. This was a kind of phrase used by many post-communist states like Poland and the Baltic states, that they wanted to get rid of and jettison their Soviet and Russian past and become again part of the European family of nations. Of course, again, that was very much anathema to Russia. So if we go to the next slide, this kind of points out the differences between Ukraine and Russia. In Russia, the kind of pro-Western liberal camp wasn't as powerful as in Ukraine. And it became progressively marginalized throughout the 1990s. And then, of course, after Vladimir Putin becomes Russian president in 2000, for the first time, the liberal camp becomes even more progressively marginalized. The young people becoming increasingly pro-Putin in Russia. In the case of Ukraine, very, very different. You have pro-Western reformers are far stronger. You have this concept of what's called national democratic forces, which you never had in Russia. National democratic forces are those that both support economic and political reforms and also support uplifting and supporting Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language and culture, and are also pro-Western, so pro-Ukraine joining or integrating, becoming members of European Union and NATO. That kind of political force doesn't really exist in Russia. The extreme right are also always a marginal force in Ukraine, despite various Western media reports. The extreme nationalists in Ukraine only once are elected into the Ukrainian parliament in 2012, when the Svoboda, Freedom political party receives 10%. Never again in any of the elections. In Russia, the extreme right were always a powerful force, and they tried twice to launch illegal coups, one in August 1991 and one in September, October of 1993 as well. And so that's very different. In the case of Ukraine as well, the communists are powerful at the beginning. They are revived, but they progressively become a declining political force. Young people in Ukraine, different to Russia, are pro-Western. In Russia, they increasingly move into the pro-Putin camp in Russia, whereas in Ukraine, young people, and especially the kind of generation born in the 80s and 90s, are pro-Western. So when we look at in the next slides, like post-Soviet transitions, we can see that Russia and Ukraine were approaching the post-Soviet era in very different ways. And there's already a great divergence between both countries. The liberal camp in Russia was always weaker. In the 1990s, it progressively gets pushed to the margins. And already before Putin first appears on the scene in 1999, when he becomes prime minister, already you have kind of a trend moving towards a more nationalistic course in Russia. And this is clearly seen when you have the changing of foreign ministers in Russia from Andrei Kozyrev, who today lives in the West and is a big critique of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he's replaced by Yevgeny Primakov, former KGB, very much kind of in the Putin mold, very much anti-Western, and seeing Russia as at the center of this big Eurasian empire. So very different. That already begins in 1996. So not really long after the USSR collapses. So the kind of Russian dabbling, Russian experimentation with liberalism, if you want to call it that, or a more liberal agenda, really only takes place in the kind of late 1980s under Gorbachev and first half of the 90s under Yeltsin. So you're talking about less than a decade. And that bucks the trend. The reality is Russia is more attuned to the kind of pre-Gorbachev conservative nationalism of the Brezhnev era, or the Putin kind of Russian imperial nationalism from the late 1990s onwards. That's the more typical Russia. The liberal Russia is the less typical Russia. In Ukraine, it's a very, very different ball game. And you can kind of see in this slide where we talk about the critical junctures in Putin's rule of Russia. He comes to power, he's appointed by Yeltsin in effect in 99 as a prime minister, then he wins the election in 2000, probably Yeltsin's worst ever decision. Russia would have gone down a different path if he had, instead of Putin, chosen Boris Nemtsov, for example, who was he was a kind of in the, shall we say, in the Alexei Navalny mold, maybe a moderate or a patriotic, but at least a post-Soviet Russian patriot and reformer, not xenophobically anti-Western, but for some reason, I think for reasons because of the fear of the Yeltsin family over the new regime going after them for corruption, they chose Putin, who gave them a guarantee that they would be safe and what they had stolen would not be taken back. So Russia is given over to the KGB. The terminology used for Russia from when Putin first is elected is that Russia becomes a militocracy. It's a country run by the Siloviki, by the security forces. The former KGB, who became FSB and SVR, now capture Russia. And they begin to mold Russia in the image that they lament the former Soviet Union. You have Sovietization of Russian life. You have the return of the Soviet national anthem with new lyrics. You have the creation of youth groups resembling the old Communist Youth League, and so on and so on. Increasing authoritarianism and repression. And this move to the more nationalistic right especially happens after the Rose and Orange revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, 2003, 2004. Russia begins moving progressively to the right, to the nationalist right. You see this with the creation of these nationalistic youth groups in Russia. Xenophobia grows against the West. Putin has his famous xenophobically anti-Western speech. In Munich in February 2007, you have the first Russian attack on a NATO member, major cyber attack against Estonia taking place. And then you have the creation of these new structures, like the Russian World Organization, which is an attempt to rebuild some kind of union of the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. You have the reunion of the so-called red and white branches of the Russian Orthodox Church, that is the Russian Orthodox Church inside Russia, which remained inside the Soviet Union, and the Russian Orthodox Church in the emigration. And the two are reunited together, which again increases nationalism inside Russia. And then you had the election of a new patriarch for the Russian Orthodox Church in 2009 called Kirill, who again moves the Russian Orthodox Church even more towards a nationalistic position. This gets even more the case, even more nationalistic after 2012, when Putin returns to the Russian presidency and begins his steps for what he sees as him going into Russian history as the new Peter the Great, the new Catherine, the Tsarina Catherine, and the new Stalin. The leader that rebuilds Russia as a great power and begins the gathering of so-called Russian lands. Here, Russian is understood as Eastern Slavic, so the rebuilding of a union of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. This is not something that Putin has just dreamt up. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, back in 1990-91, proposed that the Soviet Union, proposed to Russians, that the Soviet Union be replaced by what he called a Russian Union. And the Russian Union for Solzhenitsyn was this alliance, this union of the three Eastern Slavs. He also added northern Kazakhstan, but let's focus on the three Eastern Slavs. And Solzhenitsyn died in 2009, and at the end of his life, he was a close friend of Putin. So you have a former dissident Russian nationalist and a former KGB officer becoming allies, becoming friends. And that is not unusual in the Russian case, because they agreed on the same issues. Solzhenitsyn, who I remember reading as a teenager when his books were translated into English, when he lived in Vermont, USA, as an emigre, he was thrown out of the Soviet Union in the 1970s. He became a big critic of the West, as Russian nationalists usually are. The so-called West had lost its spiritual values, etc., etc. Typical Russian nationalistic charges. So 2012 begins this even more nationalistic phase of particularly applying pressure on Ukraine to turn its back on Europe and move back towards Russia. And this culminated, of course, in President Yanukovych agreeing to not sign the association agreement with the European Union. That provoked a popular uprising called the Euromaidan Revolution. And Yanukovych, being the coward he was, running away from Kiev, and the Euromaidan revolutionaries coming to power. Then, of course, we know what happened after that. Putin's revenge was Crimea and launching military aggression against eastern Ukraine. Then we move over to the period after 2020, where the Russian constitution is changed, making Putin de facto president for life, and repression grows inside Russia, cult of war. Russia moves from an authoritarian state to what I would call a totalitarian dictatorship. And more recently, I would even call a fascist state. This greater repression and cult of war inside Russia, and that culminates in the murder of Alexei Navalny in prison by the Russian state, culminates in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So that's the progression of Russia. It's a slow progression over a quarter of a century, practically, from Putin being appointed by Yeltsin to transforming Russia into this highly repressive dictatorship and fascist state, which has more political prisoners than existed in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, 1970s, and early 1980s. If you look at the next slide, what we have in Russia is this, and this is all leading up to the war crimes and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. What we have in Russia is a leader, Putin, who cannot accept, to this very day, cannot accept the disintegration of the Soviet Union. He's still angry about this. He's unwilling to accept it. He wants to do something about it. It's unlikely that he would be ever able to rebuild the former Soviet Union, but he wants to start at least in uniting together the three Eastern Slavic peoples. He's already got Belarus controlled. After Russia intervened to help Lukashenko put down protesters in 2020, Belarus has become a de facto puppet state of Russia. So, but the big prize is of Ukraine. You can't really have this new Russian world, this Ruski Mir, without Kiev and without Ukrainians. So in the same way as the Eastern Slavs were the core of the Soviet Union, they are meant to be, in Putin's eyes, the core of his new Eurasian empire. Linked to this is a cult of Joseph Stalin. The Joseph Stalin cult is linked to this transforming the Great Patriotic War into a religious cult as well. This is a commemoration of military victory, a celebration of military victory. It's no longer, as it was in the 1990s and Gorbachev era, something that you commemorated as a sad event, which because of the huge amount of loss of life, over 20 million people died from the Soviet Union, 6 million in Ukraine. So it's no longer lamenting the human tragedy, it's actually celebrating with pompousness the military victory of Russia's military victory, or the Soviet Union's military victory in the Great Patriotic War. And to be able to do that, and to make that such a founding principle of your regime, you also need to promote a cult of Stalin, because Stalin is the leader who defeated the Nazis. He built a new empire in Eastern Europe, and he transformed the USSR into a nuclear weapon state. But if you're going to put Stalin on a pedestal as a new great leader of the Soviet Union, then you have to forget about his crimes. You have to downplay them, marginalize them, deny them, and that's what begins to happen. Stalin's crimes are ignored and downplayed, and today opinion polls by the Levada Center, Russia's last remaining independent polling organization, show most Russians hold a positive view of Stalin, including young people, which is incredible. This has taken place during this entire period of Putin's rule of Russia. You can't imagine the same thing happening elsewhere. You can't imagine a former Gestapo officer um, being elected in Germany, becoming Chancellor of Germany, and then launching a cult of Adolf Hitler. It simply wouldn't be imaginable. But in Russia, a former KGB officer is elected president, and he launches a cult of Stalin. Another tyrant, another criminal, but nevertheless, this in Russia, this was taking place. And if you have a cult of Stalin, which denies his crimes and ignores them or downplays his crimes, then what that's going to lead to is just a lack of empathy, a lack of human life becomes simply without any value, and that directly impacts upon how the Russian army commits war crimes in Ukraine. In the case of Ukraine, very different trajectory. As we see in the next slide, I mean, Ukraine, firstly, you inherit from the Soviet Union a situation where Ukrainians were already quite mobilized. In the Soviet Union, Ukrainians were always a pain in the butt for the Soviet regime. The famous quote was Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, who actually said in his secret speech in 1956, when he denounced Stalin, he said that Stalin wanted to deport the entire Ukrainian nation, but there wasn't enough room of where to send them. This is what Khrushchev said. Ukrainians were the largest group of political prisoners in the Soviet Union. They were far bigger than their proportion in the Soviet population. So the Ukrainians in the Soviet population were about 17–18%, and the number of political prisoners, which were Ukrainians in the various concentration camps, were at least 40+%. And these were usually a mixture, so liberals, center-right, national Democrats, as well as Ukrainian nationalists. Ukrainians have protested when there's been repression or the regime has gone out of control in Ukraine. Ukrainians have risen up and protested and gone on the streets. You've had 3 of these since the beginning of the Ukrainian independence. 1990, students launched a hunger strike in the center of Kiev called the Granite Revolution. Then, of course, the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution. Russians have never had these kinds of popular uprisings. They continue to act as slaves, act as subjects. Ukrainians have become citizens. Ukrainians demand things, demand rights from their leaders. Russians don't demand rights from their leaders. They just bow their heads and do as they're told. Very different kind of trajectory in both countries. And then you can see this in the next slide, where contrary to what happened in Russia, in Ukraine, going from the late 1980s, you can actually trace it back even earlier. I remember going in 1983 to Hyde Park Corner with my father on the 50th anniversary of the Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, where mass protests in London. At a time when the Soviet Union denied there was a famine in 1933 in Ukraine. Then this kind of these protests which were taking place in the Ukrainian diaspora, and including the funding of a book by Robert Conquest, The Harvest of Sorrow, and the documentary film in Canada, The Harvest of Despair. This then moved to Ukraine under Gorbachev, late 1980s. And so you've had 30 years of de-Stalinization, de-Sovietization of Ukraine taking place at the same time as you had the opposite in Russia, where you had Re-Stalinization and Re-Sovietization in Russia. So again, showing the degree to which there was a divergence of both countries. In Ukraine, this has been taking place since the late 1980s, and it hasn't really stopped. And it kind of Yanukovych tried to stop it to some degree, but he wasn't completely successful because academics were never really controlled by Yanukovych and journalists, and you still had a free media under Yanukovych still, so that these trends continued. And by today, majority of Ukrainians have a very negative view of Joseph Stalin, unlike in Russia. And a majority of Ukrainians believe that the Holodomor was a genocide committed by the Soviet state against Ukrainians. So this is something that has taken place in Ukraine and something that the Russian state has always disliked. They don't like the fact that Ukrainians call the Holodomor a genocide or believe it was a genocide, and they don't like the fact that you've had this process of De-Stalinization, De-Sovietization. Then you have the adoption, the passage of De-communisation laws in 2015 after the revolution. And since Russia's full-scale invasion, you now have de-Russification taking place of Ukraine. These processes, which are quite fundamental and they're taking place throughout Ukraine, have never taken place inside Russia. So let's move on. I mean, the next few slides really kind of go into it in a bit more detail about what we mean as to why Russia, why a liberal kind of Russia has always been very weak, why nationalism has always been more the typical situation for Russia. These are the kinds of identities that emerged after the USSR collapsed in Russia, very different identities to what you had in Ukraine. And the first four, some kind of multinational union, Russian Empire, Soviet Union, some kind of Eastern Slavic union like Solzhenitsyn and Putin talk about, some kind of union of the Russian speakers, and some more kind of fascist racial Russia. These are the popular types of identity you found in Russia. And all of these are incompatible with democratic systems and with, of course, being part of Europe and the West. The identity which would have been best for Ukraine, for Russia's relations with the West and Russia's relations with its neighbors, would have been this last one, a civic Rossiyskaya identity, which is an identity that restricts itself to the Russian Federation, which is a kind of a post-imperial identity, which accepts that Russia is no longer an empire. So Russia following the tradition of Turkey. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Young Turks, led by Ataturk, created a new Turkish nation state from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. And that Turkish nation state was very progressive. I mean, it gave the vote to women in the 1930s before many European countries. France, the home of the French Revolution, gave the vote to women a decade after Turkey, for example. That kind of transition from the Soviet Empire to a Russian nation state didn't really happen in Russia. In fact, Russia exchanged communism not for democracy, but communism for nationalism. And that nationalism has progressively become more extreme throughout the Putin era. If we go to 2 slides further along, we can see that in Ukraine, you had a very different kind of identity mix, shall we say. You had, if you want to put it very simply, you had an identity which I call here Eastern Slavic or Pan-Russian. So an identity which looks to, say, Belarus, something like this. This is the identity that Russia supported in Ukraine always. It's an identity which had a weak, didn't have a majority support. It was promoted by only one of 6 Ukrainian presidents, Yanukovych. It was primarily dominant or quite influential in Crimea and the Donbass, but even there it had competition, and it promoted policies which, of course, Russia liked, like Russian language becoming a second state language, the centrality of the Russian Orthodox Church, no space for Ukrainian Orthodox churches. The same kind of memory politics with a great focus on the Great Patriotic War. The idea that Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians were born together 1,000 years ago in Kiev Rus, and that they will always stay together, irrespective. Ukraine being part of this Ruski Mir, this Russian Union and Eurasia, and not part of Europe. So those were the kind of ideas promoted by Yanukovych, party regions, the Communist Party, and those were the kind of ideas that Russia kept promoting in Ukraine through these political forces. But they always had the difficulty that these would have been very difficult to impose on the entire country. And nevertheless, Russia continued to do that. The alternative to this would have been an identity which is Ukrainian. And by Ukrainian, I mean an identity which regards Ukrainians as being distinctly different from Russians. In a pan-Slavic or pan-Russian identity, the differences between Russians and Ukrainians are blurred. They were kind of born together, and they kind of, they're close. They're different, but they're very, very close, and they should always be together. In a Ukrainian identity, that's very different. A Ukrainian identity says we are different to Russians, we have our own separate history, and we have our own demand to allow ourselves to decide our own destiny, our own future. And this kind of identity is something that Russia has always wanted to deny, always wanted to suppress, always wanted to oppose. But it was always really the majority identity in Ukraine. Ukraine emerged as a new country, different to Belarus, in having a far stronger identity. Yes, it wasn't uniform at the time, but it was still nevertheless quite strong, even amongst many Russian speakers of Ukraine. And that identity promoted not only Ukrainians as being distinct from Russians, but that the Ukrainian language should be the dominant language of the country, that Russian should never be allowed to be a state language. It can be, it can be tolerance, but Ukrainian was the single dominant state language, that Ukrainian history was separate to Russian. There wasn't an Eastern Slavic history. The problem with that kind of approach of an Eastern Slavic history is that Ukraine has no separate identity, because a Eastern Slavic history de facto becomes a Russian history. We were born together 1,000 years ago in Kiev Rus and will always be together. But a Ukraine history separate to Russian is the common norm. It's a norm amongst Western historians of Ukraine, like Orest Subtelny, Paul Robert Magocsi, and Serhii Plokhy and other historians in the West. Of course, it's the founding basis of the big doyen of Ukrainian history writing, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, that Ukraine and Russia have always had separate histories, and Kiev Rus, when it was destroyed by the Mongols in 1240, its legacy transferred not to Russia, its legacy transferred to the Galician Volhynian kingdom in western Ukraine. In the Russian case, they deny that completely. Russian leaders, including Putin, always talk about 1,000 years of Russian statehood, and they try to claim the history of Kiev Rus as Russian history, which of course is ridiculous, because the very word Russian and Russian Empire only appears in 1721. There was no Russia in the Middle Ages. There was a Kiev Rus. Russia did not exist then. But sadly, most Western historians of Russia, British, American, they tend to follow the Russian nationalist framework in talking about Kiev and Russia, in talking about how this is a common history for the Eastern Slavs. So Western historians, they may be left-wing and liberal, as most academics are, but they're also actually quite nationalistic in that they adopt the Russian nationalist framework for history. That changed only in the West in the 1970s and 80s, when you had the new institutions created by the Ukrainian diaspora, like the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the chair of Ukrainian history at University of Toronto, and the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. They began saying, no, we have our own separate history. So it's very important, because the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war is very much about history. Putin lives in the 19th century. Putin lives in history. And so that historical question is important. It's important also in that you can see how a statue, a huge statue to Grand Prince Volodymyr, in Russian Vladimir, was unveiled next to the Kremlin in 2016, which is completely ironic, because when he ruled Kiev Rus in the late 10th, early 11th century, there was no Moscow. Moscow was founded 160 years later in 1147. So you're putting up a monument claiming that Grand Prince Vladimir or Volodymyr is yours, part of your history, when you didn't even exist at that time. But nevertheless, this is one of the fictions of Russian history. And if they didn't do that, history would be turned on its head, and it would be Ukrainians who would be the elder brother, the oldest of the Eastern Slavs, not Russians. Russians are actually far younger, because the city of Moscow was a village in 1147, and St. Petersburg wasn't created until the early 18th century. And this Ukrainian identity, of course, also supports a post-Soviet, a post-Russian future for Ukraine outside of the Russian Empire, outside of Eurasia, outside of the Russian Union, in Europe. So very different identities, which were clashing, competing, sometimes violent, like during the Euromaidan revolution, but which this competition ends in 2014, because then you have the collapse of pro-Russianism in Ukraine. The next section we are looking at is how all of these factors then lead to the depiction of Ukrainians in Russia, and how this leads to the full-scale invasion and war between Russia and Ukraine. And again, when we look at dehumanization, this is one area where Western academics never really touched upon. This is an area that was largely ignored in Western academic writing, and yet what we had is nearly 2 decades of the Russian political leaders, state officials, journalists, think tankers, Russian media dehumanizing Ukrainians and Ukraine. This was taking place from about the mid 2000s. It was quite widespread. It was done in the education system as well as in the Russian military. And this is normal for genocides. Before genocides take place, whether it's the Holodomor in Ukraine or the Holocaust primarily against the Jews by the Nazis, you firstly have a dehumanization, the promotion of hate crimes. You need to depict these people who you're going to kill to be not humans, and therefore they don't deserve any empathy as human beings. And this has been taking place in Russia for a long period of time. and was taking and it began to speed up after 2014. So when we go to the next slide, you have this very good Russian emigre called Mikhail Zygar, who was part of the Russian opposition but had to flee from Russia, talks about how for Putin, he was obsessed with Ukraine from the very first day he first became Russian president in the year 2000. And so he's been scheming in different ways to claw or bring Ukraine back. That's to do with both the Tsarist and the Soviet legacies. Tsarist because Putin increasingly began to read pre-Soviet and kind of white Russian emigre. The whites were the defeated Russians who supported the February Revolution in Russia in 1917 or supported the Tsar. These white forces were defeated by the Reds, by the Bolsheviks, and they fled primarily to Europe, where they published many journals, articles, books, and these publications have begun creeping back to Russia, where they've been republished in huge numbers. And Putin has supported that rehabilitation, republication of these white Russian emigres, who all, of course, denied the existence of Ukrainians and Ukraine. Some of them have even had their remains being reburied in Russia under the aegis of Putin. Putin's favorite author here is a white Russian emigre, Ivan Ilyin, who was a fascist, anti-Semite, and a Ukrainophobe. So this obsession is partly that, and partly that he wants to somehow deal with the legacy which he cannot accept of the collapse of the Soviet Union, to rebuild something. And you need to rebuild this Russian Union as a way of rebuilding Russia as a great power, because Ukraine was a central important country in the Soviet Union in terms of its raw materials, industrial base, and of course military-industrial complex. So for Putin, bringing Ukraine back in is not only nationalistic and spiritual and religious, it's also foundational. He thinks that together Ukraine and Russia can take on the West far better than just Russia on its own. As Zbigniew Brzezinski once wrote in the 1990s, Russia is an empire only with Ukraine. It's Ukraine being absorbed by Russia in the kind of 17th and early 18th centuries that made Muscovy become the Russian Empire. And in that way, Putin still has this obsession with Russia. So you have this dehumanization where Ukrainians do not exist. This has been pumped into Russians for nearly 2 decades prior to the full-scale invasion. Ukrainian state is artificial. It's a product of Western conspiracies against Russia. This is deep in the Russian psyche. It's even pre-Soviet. That Ukraine is a product of Austrian, Polish, now more recently CIA, European Union conspiracies to make Russia weaker, to not allow this Russian-Ukrainian union, this hugely powerful kind of entity. That Ukrainians are one of 3 branches of a pan-Russian nation. So if in the 1930s you have the Nazis and German nationalists talking about pan-Germanism, bringing together German speakers into one state, now you have this pan-Russianism, where there's only one nation, it's Russian, and that Russian equals Eastern Slavic. So you have Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. There is no Ukrainian people, separate Ukrainian people. There's Russians and Ukrainians are one people, as Putin continuously talks about. Added to this is the idea that it's the West, this xenophobia against the West grows and grows and grows during these two decades. and it's the West which supported the so-called coup d'etat in 2014, which removed Yanukovych, brought these Nazis to power in the Euromaidan revolution. They have been transforming Ukraine into what Moscow, or what the Kremlin calls anti-Russia, and at the behest of the West, of the United States. You also have a return to pre-Gorbachev thinking in Russia. So, for example, the Holodomor, which was finally accepted by the Soviet state as having taken place as a famine in the late 1980s, is now in Russia denied. And Russia today, the Russian state, talks about the famine as a fiction, that it didn't take place, that this was dreamt up by the Ukrainian diaspora, and Robert Conquest was a British spy. So this is a kind of what we have now moved to in Russia. So this is a book I bought many years ago, thinking that it would just be a nice curiosity, nice to have on the bookshelf, not really that important. We've kind of moved on. But actually, this is a kind of literature which is now being republished in Russia and promoted to soldiers and school children and state officials. This is a typical book of Russian white emigres, published in 1920, which talks about how the whole Ukrainian question is a complete fiction, dreamt up by Austrians or the West, and that Ukrainians are in fact just little Russians. So this is a kind of dominant literature and viewpoint you have in Russia. And this quote is typical of what we now hear in Russia, that Putin is reviving this mythology that existed even prior to the Russian Revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century, that the whole Ukrainian question is simply a fiction. Of course, this is completely ridiculous, but it actually had a tremendous impact on how Putin and Russian leaders really did believe that their army in February 2022 would be greeted as liberators by Ukrainians. They really believed this, which is why they sent a very small number of troops. 170,000 is not a lot of troops for Ukraine. It's certainly not enough to conquer Ukraine if there's a fight back. The Warsaw Pact sent in 250,000 troops to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968. And Czechoslovakia had 10 million people, Ukraine has 45 million. So they only sent a small number of troops into Ukraine, believing that their own mythology, that this is a fiction. They're mainly little Russians. There's a small clique of Nazis in Kiev who will run away to the West, to their patrons in the West, whereas most little Russians will say, thank you for liberating us from these Nazis, and here are flowers and bread and salt. Of course, that wasn't reality, but that's what they believed. If we go on to, I think, the final section, we are looking at territorial claims. All of these viewpoints that you have floating around Russia feed into Russian territorial claims against Ukraine, which are deep-seated. And you see this in this first slide, where on the left you have this wonderful kind of poster with orange and the color of the pro-Western forces in the Orange Revolution. This is a map of Ukraine developed by Russian political consultants, election consultants working for Yanukovych in 2004, who depicted Ukraine as divided into these three kind of sections. You have, the guys at the top, the first group, the West Ukrainians, then you have the second group, the Central Ukrainians, and then the ones at the bottom, the so-called East Ukrainians and the Southern Ukrainians. So this is the way they're trying to present how pro-Western Ukrainians look down on Russian speakers and on Eastern Ukraine. And this is reflected in the map on the right, where Russia believes Russian nationalists view Ukraine as an artificial entity. It's composed of a mixture of of territories, where they believe Crimea was always Russian, which it never was. Crimea was Tatar more in its history than Russian. Just because Russia occupied Crimea in 1783 does not make Crimea always Russian, which Russian nationalists claim, and which actually many Western academics also wrongly write as well, because there was quite a bit of Western support for Russia's annexation of Crimea amongst academic historians and amongst Western policymakers as well. Then you have this red area, so-called New Russia, the southeast of Ukraine, which Putin has been talking about since 2008. So again, nearly 20 years. This is a territory that was wrongly included by the Soviet regime inside Ukraine. This is historical Russian lands, which should be part of Russia. And this is the territory that Russia officially annexed in September 2022, primarily two regions of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, and then Zaporizhia and Kherson. The problem is that Russia doesn't occupy 100% of any of these four regions. Ukraine has held back Russian forces in all of these areas. But this is the territorial claim. And then you have this blue area, Little Russia, which would be the plan. If Russia's invasion had gone to plan, this would have been the goal. The goal would have been Russia takes and occupies and annexes this new Russia, so leaves Ukraine with no real, no coastal, no sea coast. A little Russian puppet state remains, which is controlled by Moscow, a sort of kind of a second Belarus. And then the orange bit in the west, the West Ukraine bit, is an area that Russian nationalists have never claimed, and they say, and they continue to say in the Russian media, we'll give this to Poland or to the Hungarians. We don't want this. So this would be the plan, and this was the goal, despite this being a very old map, this would be been the goal of Russia's so-called special military operation if it had gone to plan. The breakup, the kind of destruction of the Ukraine we know, and then the annexation of part of it. So Crimea is already gone, New Russia to Russia, little Russian puppet state resembling Lukashenko's Belarus, and West Ukraine sold or given to Poland and Hungary. This is the mythology anyway. So the next slide, this is just a recap of what we've just been talking about. These territorial claims against Ukraine based on this Russian nationalist mythology of Ukraine not being a real country, being an artificial construct, of Ukrainians being really little Russians. This has been taking place for far longer than people imagined. The first time Russia really, or Putin really talked about this, of these territorial aspects of Ukraine was in 2008 in the speech to the NATO summit in Bucharest. So, and then these were revived again in 2014. Putin revives the term New Russia, which is a Tsarist term. He revives that for southeastern Ukraine. He has this idea, or this fixation that somehow Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine should be pro-Putin, should be pro-Russian, should want to demand to live as part of Russia. He doesn't understand the concept that you can be a Russian speaker in Ukraine and be a patriot of Ukraine. That simply is beyond their understanding. And the only way they can explain how Ukraine has been so resilient and so determined to fight back is by claiming that it's not the Ukrainians really are fighting, it's Russia's fighting not just Ukrainians, these sort of Nazis, but Russia is fighting NATO. Because to accept that it's the Ukrainians who are the only ones fighting in Ukraine against the Russian army would have to be something which would overturn their mythology and they'd have to accept that Ukrainians are a separate people, which they cannot do, of course, because that would completely destroy their entire rationale for this invasion. So in conclusion, Russia and Ukraine began their post-Soviet identity, post-Soviet transitions from very different starting points, from very different positions, with Russians being very nostalgic for the USSR from the beginning, from Russia adopting top-down state and nation building, Ukraine doing state and nation building from the bottom up. For most Russians, the USSR and Russia were the same thing. There was no difference. Putin even talks about historic Russia being the same as the USSR, the Soviet Union. And that was because there were no separate institutions in the Soviet Russian Republic for Russians. There was no Soviet Russian Communist Party, no Soviet Russian Academy of Sciences, unlike, say, in the other 14 non-Russian republics, where, including Kiev, where you had a Ukrainian Communist Party, you had a Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, a Ukrainian Communist Youth League. In Russia, you didn't have that. In Moscow, you only had Soviet institutions, so Soviet and Russian were the same thing. And therefore, Russians have never really accepted that Russia, in inverted commas, equals the Russian Federation. Russia, for the majority of Russians, Russia is something far bigger. Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Russian world, Eurasia, whatever. Ukraine is very different in that sense. Ukraine is like the other republics which emerged, which saw their former Soviet republic become a new independent state within those borders they inherited from the Soviet Union. Very different transitions, very different. Ukraine and Russia diverging throughout this period of time. It's not the case that the divergence only began under Putin. This is already the case in the 1990s, because Russia's period of liberalism was very small, and Russia exchanged communism for nationalism, not really for democracy. Russia under Putin, and already from the late 1990s, Re-Stalinization, Re-Sovietization of the Russian state. In Ukraine, from the late 1980s throughout the period of time, you've had De-Stalinization, De-Sovietization, De-communisation, and now more recently, De-Russification of Ukraine. So, for example, the big statue to Tsarina Catherine in Odessa, which wasn't removed after 2014, was removed now after 2022. So we have this process of decommunization moving to the removal of Russian names like Pushkin and Tolstoy, the removal of those names from street names and statues as well. Also, difference is that Ukrainians of their identities have made them into, and their popular uprisings, 3 revolutions, have made them into citizens. They have demanded rights from their leaders. In Russia, the exact opposite has happened. You've had stagnation, and Russians are still slaves. They're still subjects of the state. And with the control of the Russian media in the last 25 years, 24 years under Putin, you've had the zombification of the Russian public against Ukrainians and against the West. And this is why the casualty rate is so high in the war, and why so many Russians are willing to die for these nationalistic beliefs that the Russian state is promoting. In conclusion, it would be wrong to assume that the Russian Federation and Ukraine began to be independent states in 1992 from the same perspective and from the same starting point. They actually inherited very different legacies from the former Soviet Union. For one thing, state and nation building in Ukraine was from the bottom up. Ukraine inherited some things from the Soviet Union, but it didn't inherit a huge range of state institutions which you need to run an independent state. Russia, on the other hand, just took over everything that was in Moscow. So all of the former Soviet institutions, the government, the KGB, Ministry of Defense, Foreign Affairs, many other ministries, diplomats, you name it, were all inherited by Russia. And as we know, when you inherit these kinds of institutions, it's not just the buildings you're inheriting people and mindsets, views of the outside world, views of how Russia should be run, and of course, in particular in this case, views of Ukraine and Ukrainians. So very different starting positions. It also would be true to say that it was wrong for many Western academics, probably 10 or so or 20 years ago, who were always trying to separate and divide between a so-called democratic Yeltsin era and a non-democratic Putin era. In fact, it would be more appropriate to say that Russians exchanged communism not for democracy but for nationalism. Nationalism was always the dominant force in Russian politics already from the early 1990s. I mean, you have two hardline coups, both failed, but nevertheless hardline coups took place in August of 1991 and in the autumn of 1993. These forces that supported these two hardline coups win, but nevertheless they became mainstream under Vladimir Putin. Democracy was there only for a short period of time, and pro-democratic forces were never as strong as in Ukraine or the other republics. We're talking about liberalizing tendencies maybe existed only in the late 1980s under Gorbachev and first half of the 90s under Yeltsin. But of course, that assumes we want to ignore the fact that Boris Yeltsin used tanks to destroy the Russian parliament, which supported the hardline coup. Rather, not really a democratic act. And therefore, the trajectories, the post-Soviet transitions of Russia and Ukraine were also very different. And this led to very wide divergences between both countries in terms of, in particular, their memory politics, their approach to nation building, with Ukraine moving to De-Sovietization, De-Stalinization, and then De-communisation, and Russia going the exact opposite route, Re-Sovietization under Putin and the promotion of a Stalin cult as well. You also have, in the case of Ukraine, over 30 years, Ukrainians becoming citizens, Ukrainians becoming people who feel they have their own personal agency. And this is a product of both a democratic system, yes, flawed, but democratic system nevertheless, and three revolutions, the Granite Revolution, Orange Revolution, and Euromaidan Revolution. Russia didn't have any of this. And today, Russians remain slaves, subjects, and servants of the state. They don't feel they have any agency and any right to demand things from Putin and Russian elites. Ukrainians are very different in this sense. On a final note, this divergence obviously was growing in a kind of a slow evolutionary fashion, maybe up until 2013, but really speeded up after the Euromaidan Revolution, which in many ways was more revolutionary than the Orange Revolution. In this sense, Petro Poroshenko, as the Ukrainian president, was more of a revolutionary than Viktor Yushchenko, who didn't really accomplish very much after the Orange Revolution. Ukraine changed fundamentally after 2014, in particular in removing Russian influences Pro-Russian parties are disintegrated, were marginalized, and that in turn was even deepened with the election of Volodymyr Zelensky, who banned pro-Russian television channels and instituted criminal charges against Putin's representative in Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk. So after 2014, that Russian-Ukrainian divergence becomes wider and grows even faster. And of course, this alarms Russia and is probably one of the factors leading to its decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Thank you.